was born outside Colleton, where the river runs dark under moss, and the air can feel like a damp cloth laid over the mouth. By the time I came into town for work, emancipation was already a memory people argued about as if it were weather, and I had learned the safest kind of strength was the kind you carried quiet, like a needle in a hem. I scrubbed linen at the boarding house on Walnut Street, and on Sundays I mended choir robes for the church that paid me in coins that smelled of other hands. Folks called me steady. They meant I did not raise my voice. They meant I lowered my eyes when a white man wished it. They meant I held my thoughts as if they were contraband. When the county courthouse hired me to clean its back rooms, it was because the old clerk, Mr. Horace Whitfield, did not want boys near his ledgers. He wanted a woman who would not ask questions and would not be seen. I agreed, because steady work is a form of mercy. The records room sat behind 2 iron doors. Dust lay on the shelves like settled ash. There were crates of deeds, tax rolls, and bound books that seemed too heavy for the truth inside them. Mr. Whitfield gave me rules before he gave me a broom. Do not open any sealed packet. Do not read any margin notes. Do not touch the shelf marked "Ruddled." Do not linger near the west wall where the brick had been patched darker than the rest. He said this in the same voice a preacher uses to warn about sin, calm, certain, practiced. I nodded and said, "Yes, sir." That first week, I learned the courthouse had its own kind of silence. In the afternoon, when the clerks went to dinner, the building did not feel empty. It felt held. Sometimes from behind the west wall, there came a faint tapping, as if a finger tested the brick for weakness. On the last day of that week, I swept beneath the ruddled shelf and found a strip of old paper, folded tight as a prayer. It was not new. It was not meant for me. And yet it lay in my dustpan as if it had been waiting. There were 3 names written in a child's uncertain hand, and when I lifted the paper closer to the lamp, I saw, stamped in dried wax, the same scythe crossed with wheat. On Monday I placed the paper back where I had found it and acted as if my hands had never held it. That is how a person survives in a place built by other people's authority. You pretend you are not curious. You pretend you do not notice what does not belong, but Mr. Whitfield noticed me. He stood in the doorway of the records room with his coat still on, though the morning was warm. His eyes went first to the floor, then to my apron, then to the ruddled shelf, as if he could smell thought. "You're thorough," he said. "Yes, sir," I answered. "You'll stay thorough in the ways I said." He spoke gently, the way a hand might smooth a blanket over a sleeping child. "There are papers here that can trouble a mind. Some things were settled long ago." I did not argue. I did not lift my chin. I only asked, soft as one might ask the time, "Do you wish me to clean behind the west wall patch?" He smiled without warmth. No, that afternoon he returned with a new lock and changed it in front of me, not because a lock was needed, because showing the lock was the point. His authority was meant to be seen. Later, when I carried buckets down the hall, I passed the clerk's office and heard Mr. Whitfield speaking to Judge Amos Pullen in a low voice. I heard my own name once, then the word brick, then ruddled, spoken like a sickness. When I entered, both men looked up too quickly. Judge Pullen's face was smooth, with the kind of calm that comes from never being questioned. He nodded at me as if I were furniture that had learned to curtsy. "Lillian," Mr. Whitfield said, as if tasting whether my name could be controlled, "you will not be alone in the records room anymore. For your safety. For my safety." It sounded like kindness until you listened to the shape of it. From then on, a young deputy lingered in the doorway while I worked. He did not speak. He did not read. He watched. The quiet of his watching was its own rule. That evening, back at the boarding house, I opened my hymn book to the psalm I liked for washing days and found, pressed between the pages, a new strip of paper I had not placed there. It was blank except for a single mark, a scythe crossed with wheat, drawn in ink so fresh it shone. I began to understand that the courthouse did not only keep records, it kept people in place. The deputy's presence became a habit, like a shadow that remembered to follow. Mr. Whitfield's rules multiplied in small ways. I was told which stairwell to use, which basin to fill, which hours to come and go. Nothing written, everything enforced, and with each new rule the building felt more awake. On Wednesday, the west wall patch shed a grain of mortar that rolled across the floor like a white seed. I swept it up. On Thursday, 2 more grains fell. On Friday, the brick made that faint tapping again, steady as a slow heart. I spoke of none of this at the boarding house. A black woman's stories are often treated like smoke, noticed only to be waved away. Still, I was not entirely alone. Mrs. Evelyn Marsh, the widow who ran the boarding house, watched me one night as I folded sheets. She was a small white woman who had buried 2 sons and had learned that grief can strip away certain kinds of fear. "You've got courthouse dust in your hair," she said, and then after a pause, "That place is full of old trouble." I kept my eyes on the linen. "It's only work." "No," she said, "it's old trouble." She told me, in the careful way people tell forbidden stories, about Cypress Grove plantation and the fire that took 13 prominent men in one night. She spoke as if reciting something she had heard at a child's bedside long ago, half warning and half lullaby. She said the owner was Silas Ruddled. She said his daughter was Catherine, a woman people whispered about as unwell. She said an enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross had been brought in like a tool, then disappeared like a tool. "The papers never matched," Mrs. Marsh murmured. "The deaths were praised, but the records were thin, as if the county decided it preferred ash to ink." That night, I did something I had promised myself I would not do. I returned to the courthouse after hours, using the janitor's key Mr. Whitfield believed I would never dare to use against him. In the records room, the air smelled damp, like earth under a cellar. I touched the west wall patch. The brick was not cold. It was warm, as if something behind it had been breathing, and when I pressed my ear to the mortar, the tapping stopped, then started again, closer, as if answering. I did not sleep. In the morning, my hands shook as I folded my apron strings. I told myself it was only fatigue. I told myself the warmth in the brick was the sun. I told myself all the lies that help a person keep working. At the courthouse, Mr. Whitfield waited for me. He did not shout. He did not threaten in a loud way. He simply held out my hymn book. "You left this," he said. My stomach turned. I had not brought it. I had not dropped it. The book had been taken from my room and carried here to be used like evidence. "I didn't," I began. He raised a hand. "You don't need to explain. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm advising you." Judge Pullen stood behind him, hands clasped, face composed as Sunday stone. "You are a decent woman," the judge said. "We've heard as much. That is why we are extending you a kindness. You will quit this position. Today, there will be no complaint, no mention, no trouble. Mrs. Marsh will be told you chose to return to laundry work." My throat tightened, not because I loved the job, but because I understood what it meant. My life could be moved like a chair without my consent because they wished it. "I need the wages," I said softly. Mr. Whitfield smiled again, that same careful smile. "Then you will keep your mind on wages and off of walls." He stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Some records are buried for a reason, Lillian." It was the first time he had spoken my name without pretending to be friendly. The sound of it felt like a hand closing on my wrist. I went back to the records room with the deputy behind me. As I scrubbed the floor, my eyes kept drifting to the ruddled shelf, to the patched brick, to the place where the dust always seemed thicker, as if it rose from something underneath. At noon, when the clerks left again, I heard a new sound from behind the west wall. Not tapping, a low, muffled scratching, as if paper rubbed against stone. Then, clear as a whisper meant for one person, a single word slid through the mortar. "Ledger." I stood very still, mop dripping, and realized the worst part was not that something was hidden. The worst part was that it was asking to be found. There are moments when a person understands that staying quiet will not keep them safe. It will only keep them small. That afternoon, I carried my bucket as if nothing had changed, and I nodded when Mr. Whitfield passed. I practiced steadiness until it felt like a mask fitted to my bones, but my mind was working. If a record was behind that wall, someone had sealed it there on purpose, and if the courthouse men feared it, then the record held a kind of power they did not want in anyone else's hands. I did not have law. I did not have position. I had only what I had always had, patience, care, and the ability to remember. After supper, Mrs. Marsh gave me a candle end and did not ask why. When the boarding house slept, I returned to the courthouse with a small chisel borrowed from a carpenter I trusted, Mr. Daniel Price, who owed Mrs. Marsh a kindness from years before. Daniel did not ask questions either. He only said, "Be careful," with a gentleness that made my chest ache. The west wall patch crumbled easier than it should have. Someone had rebuilt it in haste, as if they feared time more than they feared craft. Behind the brick was a narrow space, just wide enough for a hand. My fingers touched wood, then cloth, then paper so dry it felt like leaves. I drew out a packet wrapped in oilskin. The wax seal on it was cracked, but the mark was unmistakable, the scythe crossed with wheat. Inside was a journal, its pages filled in a tight hand that shifted between neat script and frantic scrawl. On the first page, a line read like a confession, "Cypress Grove, spring. I am told to forget. I will not." The name at the bottom was Catherine Rutteld. As I read by candlelight, the years folded back. April in the year of 1841. Silas Rutteld announcing, before the county's finest, that his daughter, grown and heavy with sickness and medicines, would be placed under the complete authority of an enslaved man, Ezekiel Cross. Not as a nurse, not as a helper, as if he held her life in his hands. It was a humiliation dressed as cure, a cruel rule disguised as mercy, and beneath Catherine's words in the margin, someone else had written in a darker ink, "Do not take the ledger, copy it. Fire cleans what ink cannot." I did not know whose hand that was, but the advice felt like it had survived because it was true. Hope rose in me like a thin flame, and dread rose with it, because I understood then that the men in my courthouse had not been guarding old shame. They had been guarding an old instruction. I did not try to carry the journal out in the open. That would have been foolish. Instead, I did what women have always done when men think them harmless. I copied. In my room at the boarding house, I transcribed Catherine Rutteld's account line by line, my hand cramping, my eyes burning. I wrote about the mercury smell she described, the way her body trembled from medicines meant to keep her fogged and obedient. I wrote about Ezekiel Cross, who entered her darkened room and did not lower his gaze the way fear demanded. I wrote about his quiet knowledge of herbs, his refusal to pretend her sickness was natural when it had been planted in her like rot. Catherine's words were not kind. She was a white woman shaped by a monstrous house. Yet her journal held something I recognized. The agony of being told your truth is madness, the cruelty of being made small so others can stay powerful. Then the pages turned colder. She wrote of a cellar beneath the plantation where 13 men gathered as brethren of the harvest, of jars sealed with wax, of robes trimmed in red, of an altar table stained in ways no meal should stain it, of a ledger kept in a hidden chamber beyond a stone that swung like a door. She wrote of the night she and Ezekiel found the ledger and began to copy entries, names, dates, victims. She wrote of Silas returning early, not surprised, as if he had been waiting for their courage like a hunter waits for a deer to step into a clearing. I wrote those lines twice, because I knew how records disappear, once by fire and once by misplacement. When my copy was half finished, Mr. Whitfield appeared at the boarding house. He did not come inside. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, smile polite enough to be mistaken for manners. He asked Mrs. Marsh whether I had been well. He asked whether I spoke of the courthouse at night. He asked it the way a man asks about a leaky roof, not a human life. Mrs. Marsh said, "Lillian keeps to herself." Mr. Whitfield's eyes met mine through the screen door. His look was soft, almost pitying. "There are committees," he said, as if offering advice. "Good men who keep order. If you find yourself troubled by old stories, bring them to those men. Do not keep them." I understood then. He believed the journal already belonged to him, even before he held it. That night, as I copied Catherine's description of the Brethren's mark, I noticed something that chilled me more than any mention of cellar darkness. The scythe and wheat stamp on my courthouse forms, on certain tax petitions, on certain sealed packets, was not accidental ornament. It was a signature, and it was current. There are days when the air itself feels like a verdict. On Sunday after service, the church held a small gathering to discuss courthouse improvements. Judge Pullen was present. Mr. Whitfield stood beside him with a stack of papers. Men I had seen only as silhouettes in hallways sat in the front pews, faces smooth with practiced righteousness. I sat near the back, as I always did, hands folded, eyes lowered. I wore my plainest dress. I carried no book. I looked like nothing at all. That was my protection. Judge Pullen spoke about civic pride. Mr. Whitfield spoke about proper custody of records. Their words moved over the room like a net being cast, gentle and sure. Then Mr. Whitfield announced a new rule. The courthouse would no longer employ outside help in the records wing. The position would be reassigned. He did not say my name, but every eye slid toward me anyway, because a community knows how to read what is unspoken. I stood, my knees wanted to soften. I did not let them. I thought of my mother's hands cracked from lie. I thought of the west wall brick, warm as a secret. I thought of Catherine's line, "I am told to forget." "I will not, sir," I said, voice even. "May I ask why the ruddled papers are kept separate?" A small hush fell, not because the question was loud, because it was specific. Mr. Whitfield's smile held, but his eyes sharpened. "Those are private family matters." "Private," I repeated, like Cypress Grove was private. Judge Pullen's face did not change, but a pulse moved in his jaw. I reached into my apron pocket, not for the journal, but for my copy, folded thin. I did not wave it. I did not shout. I simply read a passage, careful and plain, about April in the year of 1841, about Silas Ruddle declaring his daughter under the authority of Ezekiel Cross, about the Brethren's ledger beneath the kitchen stairs, about 13 men gathering in robes trimmed red. I watched the front pews as I read. One man's hand twitched toward his collar. Another stared too hard at the floor. Mr. Whitfield's voice cut in, still polite, still calm. "That is a filthy fabrication." I stopped reading and looked at him. "If it is," I said, "then you will have no fear of me placing my copy with the state archivist in Columbia." For the first time, Mr. Whitfield's smile broke. Just a crack, just enough to show what lived beneath it. Behind him, on the table where the petitions lay, I saw it, a wax seal, fresh and shining, the scythe crossed with wheat. And I understood the most chilling truth of all. Cypress Grove had burned, but the Brethren had not. I did not win in the way stories promise. No judge was hauled from his bench. No confession was published in the county gazette. Men like Mr. Whitfield do not fall because a black woman speaks, but power is not only the ability to punish. Sometimes it is the ability to preserve. The next morning, I was dismissed from the courthouse. Mr. Whitfield sent a message through the deputy, as if my life were a paper to be passed along. Mrs. Marsh pressed my wages into my palm anyway and said, very quietly, "You did right," as if she were afraid even the walls might hear. That afternoon, I walked to the freight office and paid a porter to carry a sealed envelope to the state archivist. I did not write a letter full of accusations. I wrote a letter full of care. I said, "This is a copy of a journal found in a courthouse wall. It concerns a fire at Cypress Grove and the deaths of 13 men. It bears a recurring mark. Store it under restricted access. Do not return it by post. If I am harmed, assume this record is why. I kept my own copy too, because I have learned that safety sometimes requires more than one hiding place." In the weeks that followed, men I did not know lingered near the boarding house. One asked after me at the market, smiling as if we shared a joke. A new rule appeared on the church bulletin about women speaking out of turn. Small punishments, dressed as order. And yet, the tapping behind the west wall stopped. The brick stayed cold. Whatever had been sealed there had been moved or taken or destroyed. Sometimes at night, I think of Catherine Ruddle writing in her room, heavy with poison and truth. I think of Ezekiel Cross, quiet and watchful, learning the rules of a house built to crush him. I think of the ledger they copied in a hidden chamber, and the fire they chose when law would have been another trap. The courthouse will keep pretending that Cypress Grove was only an accident, but I have learned something from records and from washing stains. What is hidden does not always disappear. Sometimes it only waits. This deposition is left where hands may find it when mine are gone, because the men who call themselves harvesters still plant their rules in silence, and someone must keep the proof that the ground remembers.